Her birthday came and went with no calls, no cards, no visits. Just silence from the grandchildren she once baked for, knitted for, and kept close in every way she knew how. She didn't confront them. She didn't complain. Instead, she began sorting through her most treasured belongings, photographs, heirlooms, handwritten recipes, and quietly changing her will. By the time they sat in the lawyer's office months later, what they expected to inherit was gone, replaced with something they could never sell and might never understand. This isn't just a story about what she gave away, it's about the message she left behind, and why they'll wish they'd remembered her sooner. The morning began as so many others had. The kettle was on the stove, the faint metal rattle of water shifting inside as it began to warm. She stood at the counter, her hand lightly resting on its cool edge, the other cupped around the handle of her mug. The air in the kitchen still held a trace of last night's rain, faint and damp, the scent mixing with the sharper smell of tea leaves waiting in their tin. She didn't turn on the radio. There was no need for noise. The house was quiet enough to hear the low tick of the clock in the hallway and the small, sighing creak of the floorboards beneath her slippers. The steam began to curl upward from the kettle's spout, almost invisible at first, then stronger. She waited, not for the whistle but for the day to make itself known. It didn't. When the water was ready, she poured it over the tea bag, watching the color bloom in slow swirls, the brown deepening until it looked steady, settled. She carried the mug to the table by the front window, the one she'd sat at nearly every morning since she'd moved here. The glass was still cold to the touch when she brushed her fingertips against it. From that seat, she could see the narrow strip of pavement that led past her house. On most mornings, there would be a dog being walked, or the postman on his rounds, or one of the schoolchildren cutting across the corner on their way to class. Today the street was empty, still wet from the early rain, the puddles holding thin, quivering reflections of the hedges. Above the table, the calendar hung where it always had, its edges slightly curled from years of sun and steam. On it, one square had been circled lightly in pencil months ago. Her own handwriting, careful and even no smudge to blur it. She had marked it without thinking much at the time, a habit from years when the day had been noted by more than herself. Her gaze lingered there for a moment. The circle seemed smaller than she remembered drawing it. She took her first sip of tea, holding the mug close to her face so the warmth could reach her skin. It wasn't disappointment she felt, not the sharp, sudden kind. She'd long learned to keep that sort of thing at bay by not asking for much. It was something quieter. Pause. A missing piece in a picture she already knew by heart. After a while, she rose to tend to the laundry. The basket by the washing machine was half full, waiting. She separated the clothes without thinking. Lights in one pile, darks in another, folding the towels first, then the shirts, then the sheets. She smoothed each one with her palm before stacking it neatly. The rhythm was familiar, almost enough to fill the space the day had left empty. Almost. She thought just for a moment about the hour. Perhaps it was too early still. Perhaps a call would come in the afternoon. She pictured it, her name lighting up on someone's phone screen, their voice on the other end, a laugh, a question about her plans for the day. She stopped herself before the picture could take shape. Hope, she had learned, made silence heavier. By noon, sunlight had broken through, sending a pale beam across the table. She made lunch, soup from the freezer and bread she sliced thin. The phone sat on the table beside her, face down. It didn't buzz. She looked once more at the circled date before she stood to clear the dishes. It would stay there until tomorrow. Then she would erase it. Not to forget. Just because the day had already passed without arriving, the morning after was brighter. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the air clean and thin. Light spilled through the front window in long, deliberate beams, touching the table and the edge of the calendar above it. She sat with her tea, the steam curling faintly, her eyes on the square she had circled months ago. Yesterday's date. The pencil mark looked no different than it had the day before, soft gray, steady, unbroken, but it felt changed. Yesterday, it had been a small signal to herself, a quiet nudge that the day might matter. Today it was nothing more than proof that it had come and gone without anyone noticing. The pencil itself was on the table beside the coaster. She picked it up, turning it slowly in her fingers. The eraser was worn to an angle, smoothed from use. If she pressed down hard enough, she could make the circle vanish entirely. The space would look like every other square on the page, as if nothing had ever been marked at all. She didn't press. Not yet. Her eyes drifted over the rest of the month, Small notes in her own tidy handwriting. The date the heating bill was due. A lunch planned with Mrs. Harlan from next door. An appointment at the clinic. All ordinary. All expected. Only that one square had held any room for possibility. She tried to remember the day she'd drawn the circle. It had been in early spring. The windows were open, letting in the smell of wet earth, the air damp enough to make the paper ripple slightly. She'd been standing with the calendar in her hand, flipping forward while marking a grocery delivery, and without much thought she'd looped the pencil around the date. It had been instinct. Even after years of quieter birthdays she still marked them. Not out of expectation but out of recognition. The kind of habit that lingers even after its reason has faded. She set the pencil down and reached for her phone. The glass felt cool against her palm. She tapped it awake, scanning for notifications. None. She opened the call log anyway, even though she'd done the same the night before. No missed calls. No voice messages. No evidence of a moment she might have somehow overlooked. The phone went back to the table, face down. She returned to her tea, though it had cooled enough to lose its comfort. Her gaze wandered back to the square, the faint gray line curving neatly around a date that no longer carried weight. Some marks fade because time softens them. Others fade because you stop looking for what they mean. She reached for the pencil again. This time she pressed the eraser lightly against the paper. Not to remove it, just to feel the resistance. The calendar shifted slightly under her hand, the nail that held it to the wall creaking faintly. Then she let go. The circle would stay a little longer. Not because she needed the reminder but because erasing it now would feel like pretending it had never mattered. And it had mattered even if no one else had said so. She stood, leaving the pencil where it was. In the corner of her eye, the square caught the light, just enough to make it visible against the pale page. Some things she decided should be allowed to fade on their own. By the third morning, the circle on the calendar had grown faint in her mind. She didn't look at it when she passed the table. She didn't glance toward the wall when she poured the tea. But she noticed the phone, always the phone. It sat in its place beside the bread box, the charging cord curled neatly under it. Each time she passed the counter, her eyes flicked toward the screen, quick and almost unthinking, like checking a pot on the stove to see if it's begun to boil. The phone never lit. She had told herself more than once that people were busy. Days slipped past without meaning to, especially when the year was full and the hours were already claimed before they began. She'd heard that excuse enough times to believe part of it. But even busy people found moments for what mattered. Her tea cooled faster that morning. She was up and moving, tending to the plants in the kitchen, wiping the counter, sorting the mail that had come the day before. The envelopes were stacked in two piles, bills to be paid and paper that could go straight into the bin. There was no card among them. Once, years ago, there would have been. It might have been signed in rushed handwriting, the ink smudged at the edges. It might have arrived late, folded awkwardly with a joke written inside. But there would have been something. At 10 o'clock she checked the phone again. Still nothing. The charge was at 97%. The time glowed in the corner of the screen. She placed it back down. She remembered when calls used to be planned. Sunday evenings when long-distance charges were lower, or Saturday mornings when people were home. There was a rhythm to it, a kind of mutual keeping. Now everything could be done in an instant with no need to wait for the right time. Which made the silence sharper. By midday she had stopped glancing as often. She sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper, reading without registering every word. When she did look toward the phone, she told herself it was habit, not hope. The words tasted truer than they felt. In the afternoon she went outside. The air was cool but not cold, the grass still damp from last night's dew. She walked to the edge of the yard and back, noting the weeds along the path, the rosemary that had grown unruly near the steps. A bird called from the hedge and then fell silent. Back inside, she made herself a cup of broth, letting it steam in her hands before drinking. The warmth filled her chest, but it didn't push away the quiet. By evening the phone still hadn't rung. She set it on the table beside her chair, the light of the lamp falling across its face. It stayed dark. When she finally rose to wash the cup, she didn't take the phone with her. She left it there, uncharged now, the battery at 73%. If it rang after she went to bed, she wouldn't hear it. Some calls, she thought, only came when you were ready to let them go unanswered. The kettle had become her morning companion, its soft metal hum filling the kitchen as it warmed the water. She reached for the tin of loose leaves, lifting the lid just enough to let the scent rise. It was sharp at first, then mellow, the kind of smell that carried a memory with it. She thought of the first time she'd bought this particular tea, at a small shop in town, one she'd found by accident when she ducked in to escape the wind. That had been years ago, before the shop closed, before she'd begun ordering the tea by post. She measured the leaves carefully, letting them fall into the pot with a faint tap. The sound was small but satisfying. She poured the water slowly, watching the liquid turn a deep amber in the glass. Steam rose in gentle waves, blurring the edges of the counter for a moment. The table by the window was already set. One mug, one small plate, the folded paper from yesterday's post still pushed to the side. She carried the pot over, the warmth seeping into her fingers through the handle. She poured herself the first cup, filling it just enough to drink comfortably. No second cup waiting across from her. No extra spoon on the table. She didn't mind the quiet of breakfast alone. She had grown used to it over the years, but there had been times, once, when this same table had been crowded. 2 mugs, sometimes 3. Plates stacked at the edge. Hands reaching across for the sugar or the buttered toast. She sipped slowly, feeling the heat move down her throat. The sound of the spoon stirring the tea was the only thing in the room. Outside, the street was waking. Someone passing by with a dog, the faint rumble of a delivery van a block away. On the counter, her phone sat where she'd left it the night before. She didn't bring it to the table. She didn't need the soft distraction of checking it every few minutes. The silence had already made its place here. It didn't need to be confirmed. She reached for the butter, spreading it thin across a slice of bread. The crust flaked under the knife. She took small bites, not because she was in no hurry, but because the day would be long enough without rushing the first part of it. Halfway through the cup, she refilled it. The tea was darker now, stronger. She liked it that way. The second steep was always the best, less delicate, more certain of itself. Her eyes drifted toward the calendar again, though she hadn't meant them to. The circled date was still there, soft gray against the white. It looked smaller in the morning light, as though the paper had swallowed some of its shape overnight. She turned her gaze back to the cup, letting the steam rise and fade. She stayed at the table longer than usual, letting the tea grow cooler, the bread untouched on the plate beside her. The mug was warm in her hands, and the window glass felt cool against her fingertips when she reached out. When she finally rose, she rinsed the mug and set it on the rack to dry. The kettle was empty now, its faint warmth still lingering on the stove. She placed the tea tin back in the cupboard, closed the door, and let the small click of it shutting be the last sound in the room. The day ahead would be quiet. And that was fine. Tea for one was enough, if you let it be. She decided to go into town that morning, not because there was anything urgent to buy, but because it felt better to have a reason to step outside. The list on the counter was short: milk, a loaf of bread, and stamps. 3 things that could have waited. But she liked the structure errands gave to the day, a frame to hang the hours on. The coat by the door was light enough for early autumn, its lining soft from years of wear. She slipped it on, checked the pocket for her purse, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes the skin but doesn't bite. A thin mist still clung to the edges of the hedges, and the gravel on the path gave its small crunch beneath her shoes. She walked to the bus stop at the end of the lane, her steps unhurried. The road was quiet, just a single car passing in the opposite direction, the driver's face turned toward the middle distance. At the stop, she stood with her hands in her pockets, watching the light shift across the pavement. The bus came 5 minutes later, the same driver as last week, his nod polite but wordless. Town was not far. The bus wound its way past small rows of houses, each with a patch of front garden in varying states of care. Some were neat, the hedges trimmed sharp at the corners. Others had let the grass grow long, a few wildflowers pressing their heads through. She watched it all pass without leaning forward, her reflection faint in the window glass. The first stop was the post office. Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with paper and ink. She queued behind 2 others, reading the notice board without really absorbing its messages. Postage changes, a charity raffle, a missing cat. When her turn came, she asked for a book of stamps, sliding the coins across the counter. The clerk handed her the small booklet, its edges neat, the paper smooth under her thumb. Next was the bakery. The bell over the door gave its soft ring as she entered. The smell of warm bread filled the small space, rich and comforting. She chose a seeded loaf from the display and paid in cash, the coins clinking softly as she returned the change to her purse. The loaf was still faintly warm through the paper bag, and she held it carefully as she stepped back into the street. The grocer's was the last stop. She picked up a bottle of milk and nothing else, though she let herself wander the aisles for a few minutes. The shop radio played a song she recognized from years ago, faint under the hum of the refrigerators. By the time she reached the bus stop for the return trip, her errands were done. She stood with the bag balanced in one hand, watching a small group of schoolchildren pass on the opposite pavement, their voices quick and bright. One of them glanced her way and then back at his friends mid-laugh. The bus arrived and she took her seat near the back. She rested the bag of bread and milk on her lap, the stamps tucked safely in her purse. Through the window, the town began to slip away, replaced again by the rows of houses and the open stretch of road leading home. When she stepped off at her stop, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. She walked the last short distance to her door, unlocked it and set the bread on the counter. The errands had filled the morning. That was enough. The rest of the day would keep its quiet. The drawer had been part of her kitchen for decades, a shallow one just to the right of the sink. It was never entirely organized, not in the way she kept the rest of the house, but it was not messy either. It was the kind of drawer where things ended up when they had no better place. Rubber bands, stray keys, folded notes, a magnifying glass she rarely used. That morning, she found herself standing in front of it without knowing exactly why. The errands were done, the kettle had cooled, and the house was carrying that long, unbroken quiet that made time stretch. She reached out, then stopped, resting her fingertips lightly on the drawer's edge. It had been months since she'd opened it. When she finally pulled it forward, the faint scent of old paper and wood dust rose to meet her. The contents shifted slightly with the movement, a small shuffle of objects settling into new positions. On top was a half-used packet of candles, the kind meant for birthdays, thin and striped. She'd bought them years ago when she thought she might still bake cakes for the grandchildren. Most of them had never been used. She touched one lightly, red wax, a little dulled from time, and then set it aside. Beneath the candles was a stack of envelopes, some blank, others with writing on the front. She recognized her own handwriting in most of them, notes she'd once written and never sent. One was addressed to her daughter, the words faint where the ink had begun to fade. She didn't open it. She knew what it said, ordinary updates about her garden, a recipe she'd promised to share, a small mention of the grandchildren's last visit. She set the envelopes down and lifted the magnifying glass, the handle smooth under her fingers. It had belonged to her husband, who'd kept it on his desk for years. He'd used it to read fine print on bills or inspect the sharpness of a fishing hook. She tilted it toward the light, watching how the glass bent the edges of the kitchen window in its curve. Then she returned it to its place. Further back in the drawer was a photograph, curled at the edges, the colors softened with age. It showed the kitchen as it had been decades ago, brighter curtains, a different table, the walls still painted in the pale yellow she'd chosen when the house was new. She was in the picture, standing at the counter with a mixing bowl, her hair tied back with a scarf. The person who'd taken it had captured her mid-laugh, one hand lifted as if she'd been saying something. She placed the photograph beside the candles, letting it rest flat. There was also a single coin at the bottom of the drawer, foreign, from a trip she'd taken before the children were born. She held it between her fingers, feeling its unfamiliar weight, the faint ridges along its edge. She couldn't remember which country it was from, only that she had kept it because it felt like something worth keeping. When she had gone through everything, she returned most of it to the drawer exactly as it had been. The candles, the envelopes, the magnifying glass, the coin, all slid back into their quiet arrangement. Only the photograph stayed out. She left it on the counter, face up, so the room could see itself as it once was. She closed the drawer softly. It was not a decision to empty it, nor to sort it. Some drawers were meant to be opened only now and then, just enough to remind you of what they hold. The photograph stayed where it was for the rest of the day, catching the light as the sun moved across the kitchen. The photograph lay on the counter all through the evening before, its edges lifting slightly as if it were trying to rise from the flat surface. By morning, the light from the kitchen window reached it again, spilling across the faded image. She paused with the kettle in her hand, looking down at herself as she had been, standing in this same kitchen, a younger version with more color in her cheeks, her hands busy with some long-forgotten recipe. In the picture, the curtains had been patterned with pale blue flowers. The table was round then, not the square one she had now. She remembered that day faintly, not for the moment the picture had been taken but for the warmth in the house, the sound of someone moving just out of frame. Whoever held the camera had made her laugh. Something easy, not the kind that strains. She set the kettle on the stove and picked up the photograph, holding it by the corners. The paper was thin from age, soft in a way newer prints never were. She turned it over. The back was blank. No date, no name, no note about the occasion. She thought of writing one now, but the moment felt too far past to label. The fridge door stood a few steps away, its surface already holding other small markers of her life. A shopping list written on a scrap of lined paper. A faded recipe clipping held by a magnet shaped like a pear. A postcard from a friend, sent years ago, showing a coastline she'd never visited. She cleared a small space between them. From the drawer by the sink, she took out a magnet, plain black and chipped at one corner. She placed the photograph against the fridge and pinned it there with the magnet's weight. The image sat slightly crooked and she left it that way. Too straight and it would look arranged, purposeful. This felt better, like it had simply found its place. As the kettle began to hum, she stood back and looked at the fridge. The photograph caught the morning light in a way that made the colors seem stronger. Her younger self looked busy, intent on the bowl in front of her. The kitchen in the background was neat but not as orderly as it was now. There were signs of a meal in progress, a sense that someone else might enter the frame at any moment. She poured her tea and returned to the table, her chair angled so that the fridge was in view. Each time she lifted her cup, her eyes found the photograph again. Not out of longing, exactly, but out of a kind of quiet recognition. An acknowledgement that the person in that picture was still part of her, even if the years had shifted so much around her. Later, when she went about her day, watering the plants, folding the laundry, she passed the fridge often. Each time she caught sight of the photograph. It was strange how it made the kitchen feel different, as if it had pulled a piece of the past forward into the room. By evening she had grown used to it being there. The magnet held firm, the corners of the photograph uncurled. She thought briefly about whether anyone else would notice it if they came into the kitchen. She imagined a visitor glancing toward the fridge, maybe asking when it was taken, maybe not asking at all. She left it there when she turned out the light. The photograph would be the first thing she saw in the morning, a reminder that the room had held more than one version of her, and that both were still here in their own way. The next morning, she lingered at the table longer than usual. The photograph on the fridge was still there, leaning ever so slightly under the magnet's weight. The light had shifted since yesterday, catching the edges of the picture and throwing a faint shadow across the postcard beside it. She sipped her tea slowly, her gaze fixed not on the photograph, but on the narrow slice of the outside world she could see through the window, just a strip of the lane and the hedge that marked the boundary of her garden. It had been a while since she'd gone as far as the gate without a reason. The post usually came late enough in the day that she could hear the rattle of it through the letter slot. Still, the morning air looked clear and fresh, and the quietness inside the house felt heavier than usual. She decided to step out. Her shoes were by the door, worn in a way that made them easy to slip on. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her and stepped into the coolness outside. The gravel path gave its small crunch underfoot, the sound oddly loud against the stillness. The garden was as she'd left it. The rosemary bush near the steps had grown in every direction, and the small patch of marigolds, stubborn in the chill, still held their orange blooms. She reached down to pinch one of the rosemary sprigs, rolling it between her fingers until the scent came free. She followed the path toward the gate, her pace unhurried. The grass along the edges was damp with dew, catching the light in tiny sparks. The air smelled faintly of earth and wood smoke. Someone nearby must have lit their stove early. At the gate, she paused, resting her hand on the worn top rail. The paint had peeled away over the years, leaving the wood bare in places, smooth from the touch of hands opening and closing it. She looked up and down the lane. Nothing stirred. No cars. No bicycles. Just the soft hum of distant bird song and the faint rustle of leaves when the wind shifted. She leaned against the post for a moment, her eyes drifting toward the hedge opposite. In the past, she'd often stood here to watch for visitors, waiting for a familiar shape to appear at the bend, or for the sound of voices to carry toward her. Today there was no such expectation, only the simple act of being here. The post box at the gate was empty when she opened it. She closed it gently, the metal catching for a moment before settling into place. Turning back toward the house, she took her time, noticing small things she might have missed otherwise. The way the ivy had climbed another inch up the side wall, the tiny crack forming in one of the paving stones, the quiet persistence of a single daisy growing between them. At the steps, she stopped and looked back one more time at the lane. It was still empty, but she didn't feel the same weight she had when she'd first stepped out. There was something grounding in the short walk, the simple movement between one boundary and another. Inside, she set her shoes neatly by the door again and hung her cardigan on its hook. The smell of rosemary lingered on her fingers. She rinsed her hands, the scent fading under the tap's steady stream. She glanced toward the fridge before sitting down again. The photograph was still there, and the quiet inside seemed a little less sharp now. Sometimes, she thought, a small walk was enough to keep the day from feeling closed in. The post usually arrived by late morning, the sound of the slot opening a small punctuation mark in the quiet. She could almost tell the time by it. Some days it came earlier, some days later, but it always came. That morning, she made her tea with one ear tilted toward the front door, listening for the faint shuffle of footsteps on the path. The kettle hissed and clicked as it cooled, the sound masking anything beyond the walls. She poured the tea into her mug and carried it to the table, setting it down without sitting. The clock on the wall ticked its steady rhythm. 10:30. She moved to the window beside the door, pulling the curtain just enough to see the lane. Empty. The hedge across the way cast a darker shadow today, the sun not yet high enough to spill fully over it. She sat at the table and opened the paper, folding it neatly so the crossword faced her. She filled in a few words, her pen scratching softly against the newsprint, but her attention kept drifting. At 11:15, she looked toward the door again. Still nothing. The bread from yesterday's errand sat on the counter, wrapped in its paper. She cut a slice, spread butter across it in thin strokes, and ate standing by the sink. The taste was fine, but she barely noticed it. She rinsed the knife and returned it to its place. By 11, she began to think the post was simply late. It happened from time to time, weather, roadworks, a different route. She told herself there was no reason to check again until she heard the sound of it arriving. Yet a few minutes later, she found herself glancing at the door once more. The minutes stretched, the house feeling more still with each one. The tea cooled in the mug. Outside, the air had the washed look of a day that might turn bright, though the lane remained quiet. At noon, she opened the door and stepped out. The gate was closed, the postbox still shut. She lifted the lid and looked inside. Empty. She stood there for a moment, scanning the lane in both directions. Not a sound, not even the distant hum of an engine. She closed the lid and went back inside, wiping her hands on a towel as if she'd been doing something more than waiting. She made herself another cup of tea, this one stronger, letting the leaves steep a little longer. The warmth spread through the mug into her hands. She took it to the table, sat down, and finally let her eyes rest on the crossword again. By late afternoon, she had stopped listening for the post. The day had shifted into that slower stretch before evening, and she no longer expected the sound of the slot at all. Sometimes the post didn't come, and when it didn't, the day simply kept going without it. Before bed, she checked the box one last time, more out of habit than hope. Still empty. She closed it gently and turned the key in the lock. Inside, the house was quiet again. The absence was not heavy, just complete. The kind of silence that came when nothing had arrived to interrupt it. The phone had sat on the counter all night, its screen dark, the charging cord still coiled neatly beside it. She had not bothered to plug it in before bed. There was no reason. It had been at 73% the last time she checked, and it would last days on that without use. In the morning, she made tea without glancing at it. The kettle hissed, the cup warmed in her hands, the steam curled upward. Only after she sat at the table did her eyes wander toward the counter. The phone lay where it always did, its shape and weight unchanged, a quiet object that could hold the possibility of voices. She had once kept it charged without fail, even overnight, as if letting the battery drop too low was a kind of neglect. But the habit had loosened. Messages, when they came, were brief. Calls were rarer still. She had learned that nothing urgent was likely to appear, and if it did, it would still be there when she next looked. She sipped her tea slowly, tracing her finger along the edge of the mug. Outside, the early light was pale, the kind that seemed to soften the edges of things. She let her gaze rest on the window rather than the counter. The phone remained untouched through the morning. She moved about the kitchen, folding the dishcloth, sweeping the small scatter of crumbs near the breadboard. The chores filled the silence, each task small but tangible. By mid-morning the battery was at 68%. She saw the number when she passed by, though she hadn't picked it up. She could charge it then but decided not to. There was no harm in letting it drift lower. In the afternoon she sat in the armchair by the window with a book. The phone stayed in the kitchen. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from her seat, the occasional creak of the house as it settled. Each time she turned a page she thought briefly of whether the screen might be lit now, but she didn't rise to check. The sun began to lower, its light angling through the window and warming the carpet at her feet. She closed the book, resting it on the side table, and listened to the quiet. The phone still hadn't rung. She imagined its battery drifting lower, 50%, 49, yet still holding enough to last another day. When evening came she prepared a simple meal. She set one place at the table, the fork and knife aligned neatly. The phone sat just within her line of sight but never moved. She ate without reaching for it, without checking for anything that might have arrived unseen. After the dishes were washed and dried, she switched off the kitchen light. The phone stayed on the counter in the dark, its face still and unlit. That night, she left it where it was again, the charging cord still looped beside it. She thought of plugging it in for a moment, then decided against it. There was something oddly freeing about not tending to it. The battery would fall on its own, whether she watched it or not. In the quiet of her bedroom, she lay down and listened to the faint hum of the house. The phone, somewhere in the dark kitchen, would wait until she decided otherwise. It was the kind of morning that felt undecided, clouds hanging low but not yet bringing rain, the air mild enough to leave her coat unbuttoned. She had written a short list on the back of an envelope: tea, eggs, soap. None of it urgent, but enough to take her into town again. The bus arrived with its usual sigh of brakes. She took her seat near the middle, watching the familiar route slip past, hedges trimmed unevenly, a postbox leaning slightly to one side, the narrow bend where the road seemed to draw in its breath. A man across the aisle read a folded newspaper without looking up once. The supermarket's automatic doors opened with a faint whoosh. Inside, the lights were bright in a way that made her blink. She picked up a basket and began at the far end, starting with the rows of dry goods. The aisles were quiet, just a few others moving slowly, their wheels or baskets making soft clicks against the floor. She passed the shelves of tea, scanning for the familiar tin. It sat slightly out of place, nudged back by some earlier hand. She reached for it, feeling the smooth metal under her fingers. Into the basket it went, the weight of it settling among the lighter items. Next were the eggs. She paused at the refrigerated section, opening a carton to check each one, a habit that had stayed with her for years. The shells were unbroken, their pale brown surface catching the light. She closed the lid and set it gently in the basket. The soap was further along. She chose the same kind she always did, the scent faint and clean, nothing too sweet. She stood for a moment at the shelf, letting her eyes pass over the brighter, more perfumed boxes without touching them. She had no need for much else, but she let herself wander a little. Past the fruit, apples in neat rows, bananas in small clusters. Past the bread, where the loaves were bagged in crinkling plastic instead of the paper she preferred. She picked up nothing more. At the far end of the store, she turned into the household aisle, the one she rarely needed. There was something comforting about its quiet, rows of items that would last months, waiting patiently for the right hand to take them. She walked slowly, the soles of her shoes making a dull sound against the smooth floor. She saw no one she knew. That was not unusual, but it gave the morning a certain stillness, as if she were moving through a place that existed apart from her own life. The voices she heard belonged to strangers, faint and passing, fragments of conversation that meant nothing to her. At the checkout, she placed each item on the belt with care. The cashier greeted her with a nod but said little. She paid in cash, the coins cool in her palm, and slipped the receipt into her purse without looking at it. The bus ride home was quiet. She sat with the bag on her lap, the eggs cushioned by the tea tin and soap. The clouds outside had shifted, a little lighter now, the edges breaking enough to let in a strip of pale blue. Back at her door, she unlocked it and stepped inside, setting the bag on the counter. She put each item away where it belonged, the motions practiced and steady. When the basket was empty, she folded it neatly and set it beside the door for next time. The house felt the same as when she'd left, the quiet unchanged. Only the faint smell of the supermarket's air clung to her coat, a scent that would fade by evening. It was mid-afternoon when the sound of voices drifted faintly through her open kitchen window. She was standing at the sink, rinsing a cup, when the laughter came, bright, overlapping, carrying along the lane. She glanced out but could see nothing from this angle, only the hedge that bordered her garden. The voices moved on, fading and then rising again as if the group had stopped further up. She dried the cup and set it on the rack. The house felt a little different with the sound still faintly in the air, as though the quiet had been stirred but not fully broken. Curiosity nudged her to the front door. She stepped out, the afternoon light warm on her shoulders, and looked toward the bend in the lane. A cluster of cars was parked along the verge near the old gatehouse, more than she usually saw at once. She could make out figures carrying bags and wrapped parcels, a few holding bunches of flowers. They moved with the easy familiarity of people arriving somewhere they expected to be welcome. It took her a moment to connect them. The woman in the blue dress was her neighbor's daughter. The man carrying the folding chair was married to her niece. She recognized another face from the supermarket, someone she had spoken to once in passing. There was a gathering then. One she hadn't heard about. She stayed at her gate, not moving closer. The group disappeared beyond the bend toward a house she knew well. She imagined the clatter of a door opening, the sound of greetings, the low murmur of coats being hung and chairs arranged. Back inside she sat at the table. The photograph on the fridge caught her eye, its younger self busy with some long-ago task. She wondered if she had been the kind of person who was remembered for invitations, or the kind who was remembered only in passing, when someone else thought to mention her name. She told herself it might have been an oversight. Not everything reached everyone. Cards went astray, lists missed a name. And yet, she could not recall the last time she had been included in something like that. Something planned and anticipated, where her presence was expected rather than optional. The sound of a car door closing floated through the open window, followed by more voices, a burst of laughter. She could almost picture the tables being set, the clink of glasses, the easy rhythm of people who had known each other for years. Her tea had cooled by the time she thought to drink it. She carried the cup to the sink, rinsed it again and left it to dry beside the first. The house settled back into its quiet, though the edges of the silence felt sharper now. In the evening, as the light faded, she saw the cars returning past her window, their headlights catching briefly on the gravel. The voices were fainter now, the laughter softer, the kind that comes after a day of talking. She didn't watch them go, only noted the sound as part of the night returning to itself. By the time she switched off the kitchen light, the lane was empty again. Whatever had been shared beyond the bend was over, and nothing of it had touched her door. The recipe box sat on the highest shelf of the pantry, pushed so far back that she could almost forget it was there. It had belonged to her mother, a small wooden thing with a brass clasp that no longer caught. The lid had a shallow scratch along its top, a mark she remembered from childhood, though she couldn't recall how it had happened. That morning she brought a chair over and stood carefully, her hand brushing past the cool tins and jars until her fingers found the box. It was lighter than she expected. She carried it to the table, setting it down gently as if the years had made it fragile. The clasp opened without resistance. Inside were index cards, some in her mother's careful handwriting, others in her own, written when she was young enough to think she might make every dish she learned about. The paper was soft at the edges, the ink faded to pale brown. The first card was for a sponge cake, simple but written with exact measurements and small notes in the margins. Use room temp eggs was underlined twice. She remembered watching her mother separate the yolks and whites, her movements practiced and quiet, the kitchen carrying the smell of sugar and vanilla. Beneath that were other recipes, lentil soup, pickled beets, a stew her father liked on winter nights. Some were written on the backs of envelopes, others on lined paper torn from notebooks. She ran her fingers over them without taking any out, the slight ridge of the handwriting familiar under her touch. Near the bottom was one she had written herself years ago, for a cake she had made only once. The paper was blotched with something, perhaps milk, perhaps a drop of batter from that day. She had made it for a birthday, though she couldn't remember whose now. The recipe had never been repeated, not because it had failed, but because the day had passed without anyone asking for it again. She thought about making one of them now, perhaps the sponge cake. But the idea of baking for no one in particular felt both appealing and strange. She imagined the process, the slow measuring, the whisking, the way the smell would fill the kitchen, and then the finished cake sitting untouched, its slices waiting in silence. She closed the box for a moment, resting her hands on the lid. The wood was smooth from years of handling. There was comfort in its weight, in the way it held these small pieces of the past. When she opened it again, she chose a card at random. It was for a bread her mother had made in the weeks before holidays. The instructions were short, the ingredients few. She read it twice, imagining the feel of the dough under her palms, the steady rhythm of kneading. She set the card on the table and went to the cupboard for flour. The bag was nearly full. She sifted some into a bowl, the fine dust lifting briefly into the air before settling. The salt followed, then the yeast dissolved in warm water. Her hands moved without hurry, folding the mixture together until it began to form something solid. As she worked, the kitchen took on the scent she remembered. The dough rose slowly on the counter, covered with a clean towel. When it was ready, she shaped it and slid it into the oven. Later, when the bread was done, she placed it on a rack to cool. The crust was golden, the sound of it crackling softly as it met the air. She cut a single slice for herself, the steam rising in faint wisps. The rest she left whole, the loaf resting quietly on the counter. The bread cooled on the counter, its crust hardening just enough to give a soft crackle each time the kitchen door opened and let in a draft. She had cut only one slice earlier, eaten with butter that melted into the warmth, leaving a small crescent of crumbs on the plate. The rest of the loaf sat untouched, its shape intact, the scoring on top still visible like faint marks in the sand. She wrapped it loosely in a clean cloth, the way her mother had done, folding the corners in so that it sat like a parcel. The cloth was plain white cotton, worn thin from years of washing, with a frayed edge that curled inward. She placed the wrapped loaf at the center of the table, not in the bread tin, not tucked away in the pantry. It stayed where it could be seen, as if waiting. Through the afternoon she passed by it often. On her way to the kettle, to the pantry, to the door. Each time she glanced at it, half expecting it to look different somehow, smaller, perhaps, or softer, but it remained exactly as it had been, unmoving in its cloth. The smell lingered in the air, the faint sweetness of yeast mixed with the earthy scent of the crust. It was a smell that seemed to belong to a house full of people, even though the rooms around her were quiet. By late afternoon she thought about cutting another slice. She imagined the sound of the knife meeting the crust, the way the crumb inside would still be tender. But she didn't. Instead, she made tea and sat at the table with the loaf in view. The steam from the cup blurred her sight of it now and then, but the shape was always there, steady. She considered whether she might share it. A neighbor could take some, or perhaps she could bring it to the church kitchen. But she had not planned for either, and the thought of knocking on a door without reason seemed more unusual now than it once would have. Evening came. The light through the window shifted to a deeper gold, catching the edges of the cloth so that the threads looked almost bright. The loaf seemed heavier in the fading light, as if it had settled into its place for the night. She cleared the table for supper, but she left the loaf where it was. She ate simply, soup from a small pot, a handful of crackers, without touching the bread again. It was not that she wanted to keep it untouched, it was simply that it felt complete as it was. After washing the dishes, she dried her hands and stood for a moment beside the table. The bread would keep another day. She considered placing it in the bread tin after all, but the idea of covering it entirely seemed unnecessary. She folded the cloth a little tighter instead, smoothing the fabric over the curve of the loaf. When she turned off the kitchen light, the outline of it was still visible in the dimness, a small shape on the table in the dark. She left it there whole as she walked to her bedroom. By morning she thought she might cut another slice. Or she might not. Some things were as much about being there as they were about being used. The drawer was not locked, though it might as well have been for how rarely she opened it. It was the top one in the small desk by the window, the place where she kept the kinds of things that did not have a daily use: spare keys, a roll of tape, the stub of a candle from last winter. That morning, while looking for a pen, she pulled the drawer open farther than usual. The envelope was there, resting at an angle on top of a stack of old letters. Its paper had yellowed slightly at the edges and the flap was sealed. There was no address on it, only her own handwriting, 3 words written in blue ink, "For the reading." She had written them months ago, maybe longer. She couldn't remember the exact day, only that it had been after one of those afternoons when the quiet felt heavier than usual. The envelope was light when she picked it up, almost weightless in her hand. She sat at the desk and turned it over once, twice, feeling the smoothness of the paper beneath her fingertips. She did not open it. That was not its purpose, not yet. The contents were meant for another time, a time when she would not be the one to hold it. Sliding the envelope back into the drawer, she noticed the letters beneath it. Some were decades old, written on lined paper in the tidy hand of friends who were no longer alive. She lifted the top one, careful not to crease it further, and read a single line before folding it shut again. The words were kind, ordinary. They carried no urgency now, but they had once been something someone had thought worth sending. She left the letters as they were and closed the drawer halfway, the envelope still resting on top. She thought about moving it somewhere safer, into the tin under her bed perhaps, or between the pages of a book, but decided against it. The desk drawer was as good a place as any. Later, as she made tea, her eyes drifted toward the desk again. The sunlight had shifted, falling across the wood so that the grain showed clearly. She could see just the edge of the drawer from where she stood, and she imagined the envelope inside, waiting without impatience. It was strange, she thought, how something so light could feel as though it carried weight. The knowledge of it was enough to change the air of the room. In the afternoon she sat at the desk again, this time with the pen she had originally been searching for. She wrote a short note on a fresh piece of paper, folded it neatly, and slipped it into another envelope. This one she left unsealed. It was not for the same purpose. It was simply a note she might deliver tomorrow. The sealed envelope remained untouched. She did not need to check its contents to know what they were. The words she had written would not change. When evening came, she slid the drawer fully shut, pressing it until the small click of the catch sounded. The envelope was out of sight again, but its presence stayed in her mind. Some things were made to be used, others to be kept. And some, like that envelope, were made to wait. The appointment had been written on her calendar for weeks, a small square of ink among otherwise empty days. She had underlined it once, not for urgency but to keep it from slipping quietly past as things sometimes did. The morning came without fuss. She dressed simply, wool skirt, plain cardigan, and placed the envelope from the drawer into her handbag, along with her glasses and a folded list of points she wanted to discuss. The bus ride into town was steady, the streets neither busy nor empty. She sat near the window, her hands resting on the bag in her lap. The familiar landmarks passed by in silence: brick houses, the small park with its bare winter trees, the narrow bridge over the slow-moving river. The lawyer's office was on the second floor of a narrow building, its entrance marked only by a brass plaque beside the door. Inside, the air was warm, the smell faintly of old carpet and paper. A young receptionist greeted her politely and asked her to wait. She chose a chair near the window where the light was soft and diffused by thin curtains. When her name was called, she followed the lawyer, a man in his 60s with careful manners, into his office. The desk was wide but uncluttered, a single stack of papers on one side, a fountain pen resting neatly beside it. They began with small details, verifying names, addresses, dates. He spoke slowly, his tone steady, the kind of voice used for things that were meant to be exact. She answered each question without hurry, unfolding her list when it was her turn to speak. She explained what she wanted changed. Certain items moved from one name to another. A note added here, a line removed there. Some of it was practical, ensuring that things would pass without confusion. But other parts were less expected. She watched his pen pause slightly as she described how she wished certain belongings to be given, not to the obvious recipients, but to others entirely. He asked if she was certain. She said she was. Her voice did not waver. The envelope from her bag was placed on the desk. She told him when it should be opened and by whom. He nodded, making a small note in the margin of his papers. They spoke for nearly an hour. By the end, the necessary forms had been prepared. She signed them one by one, the sound of the pen moving across the paper the only noise in the room. When it was done, he gathered the pages neatly, tapping them into a straight stack before setting them aside. He asked if there was anything else. She said no, that would be all. Back in the waiting area, she buttoned her coat and stepped into the mild air outside. The street was unchanged, the same cars passing, the same faint smell of the bakery a few doors down. She walked to the bus stop without looking back at the building. On the ride home, she kept her hands folded in her lap, the space in her bag now slightly lighter without the envelope. The changes were made. The instructions were clear. There was nothing more to add. When she reached her street, she paused at her gate for a moment, the house ahead looking exactly as she had left it. The day had gone on as it always did, but something had shifted, quietly, in a way only she knew. The box had been there for years, balanced neatly on the top of the wardrobe in her bedroom. It was not hidden exactly, just placed high enough that it never drew attention. The cardboard had faded in patches where the light reached it through the curtains, and a fine layer of dust softened its edges. That morning she brought in the small stepladder from the hall cupboard. The ladder's hinges clicked into place with a sound that echoed faintly in the stillness of the room. She climbed slowly, steadying herself with one hand on the wardrobe's edge. When her fingertips brushed the box, it felt cooler than she expected, the air up there untouched by the warmth of the room. She lowered it carefully to the bed. It was heavier than she remembered, and the weight shifted slightly inside as she set it down. Sitting beside it, she lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was a folded wool scarf, deep blue, the kind worn in winters long past. Beneath it lay a collection of things with no single theme: an old photograph in a silver frame, a brooch missing its clasp, a set of playing cards tied with string. Each item seemed to carry its own small story. The brooch had belonged to her sister, worn only on Sundays, the missing clasp never replaced after it broke. The playing cards were from a holiday trip taken decades ago, the edges worn soft from use. She remembered evenings of quiet games at the kitchen table, the shuffling and dealing done without speaking much at all. Toward the bottom of the box were letters, some tied together with ribbon, others loose. She lifted one at random. The paper was thin and faintly yellow, the handwriting familiar. It was not a letter of importance, just a note about weather and garden work, but it carried the weight of a voice she would never hear again. There was also a small notebook, its pages filled in her own hand. Lists of books to read, recipes to try, errands that had long since been done. The ink had faded on some entries, smudged on others where her thumb had pressed against the page. She closed the notebook and set it aside. The items in the box were not valuable in the way money measured, but they were the kind of things that might matter to someone willing to know their history. She wondered who that might be. Leaning forward, she rearranged the contents so they fit more neatly. The scarf on top again, the letters together, the small objects tucked at the corner so they would not shift. When the lid was replaced, the box looked exactly as it had before, ordinary, unremarkable from the outside. She thought about leaving it where it was, but instead carried it to the wardrobe's lower shelf, within easier reach. If she wanted to look again, she wouldn't need the ladder. The afternoon light had moved across the bed, touching the edge of the box with a pale stripe. She sat for a while, the wardrobe door open, the room holding the faint scent of wool and old paper. When she finally closed the door, the box stayed on the lower shelf, visible each time she passed. It was the same box it had always been, but now it felt a little closer, as though it were no longer simply waiting to be forgotten. The photograph had been in the same spot for so long that its presence had become part of the room itself. It stood in a plain wooden frame on the mantel, just to the left of the clock, facing slightly toward the armchair where she usually sat. She dusted around it each week, lifting it carefully, running the cloth across the wood, then setting it back at the exact angle it had always been. The glass was slightly scratched in one corner, though it didn't touch the image inside. That afternoon, with the fire unlit and the room cool, she found herself studying it longer than usual. It had been taken decades ago, outside in early spring. The people in it stood close together, their coats buttoned, their shoes half lost in grass that still carried winter's dull color. She was there too, at the edge, looking toward the camera but not quite smiling. The others in the picture had all changed in one way or another since then. Some were gone entirely. Others had aged into faces she barely recognized now. Yet in the photograph they were all held at that single moment, fixed in the same weather, wearing the same expressions, caught in a time that no longer moved. She remembered the day in fragments. The air had been damp but not cold. Someone had brought a tin of biscuits. The picture was taken quickly, almost as an afterthought, before the group began to scatter toward cars and buses. She wondered who had kept the original. This copy had been given to her years later, the edges trimmed to fit the frame. The paper had faded slightly, giving everything a warmer tone, as if the light of that day had deepened with age. Her gaze stayed on her own face in the picture. Younger, yes, but also different in a way she couldn't quite define. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, or the way she looked at the person holding the camera. That moment had been unremarkable at the time, yet here it was, surviving in sharper detail than whole weeks she could no longer recall. She reached out and picked up the frame. It was lighter than she expected. Turning it over, she slid out the back panel. The photo came free easily, the paper smooth against her fingertips. On the reverse, written in pencil, was a single date. No names, no note. Just the numbers marking the day it was taken. She traced them with her thumb before returning the photo to its place. The frame clicked shut with a sound that seemed slightly louder in the stillness of the room. Setting it back on the mantel, she adjusted it until the angle matched what it had been before. The clock beside it ticked evenly, marking the moments passing. Later, as the afternoon dimmed, she lit the fire. The light from the flames reached the photograph, catching the glass so that for a few moments her own reflection hovered there alongside the younger version of herself. She watched until the glass cleared again, leaving only the image behind. The clock chimed softly. She did not move the photograph again. It would remain where it had always been, steady against the slow turning of the days. The decision had not come in a single moment. It had arrived slowly, like the way light shifts across a wall in the afternoon, almost unnoticed until it is entirely different. She could not point to the exact day she knew, only that by the time she sat at the table that morning, the choice felt complete. There was no ceremony in it, no need for one. She placed her tea on the table and opened her notebook, turning to a blank page. The pen moved without hesitation, the words simple and spare. They were not instructions, not really. More like markers, reminders for when the time came to put them into effect. She paused only once, halfway through the list, to look toward the mantel where the photograph stood. Then she continued, her handwriting steady, the lines evenly spaced. The pages before it in the notebook held other lists, groceries, errands, notes from phone calls, but this one was different. It was written not for the week ahead, but for after. When she finished, she closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf by the window. The sun caught the cover for a moment, the light shifting as a thin cloud passed. She sat still, hands folded, feeling the quiet settle around her again. She did not think of the decision as final, though she knew she would not change it. It was simply set, like a stone placed where it would remain. The rest of the day went on as usual. She washed the breakfast dishes, folded the laundry, moved a plant closer to the light. None of it was different, yet the knowledge of the choice sat quietly in the background of each action. In the afternoon, she walked to the post box with a small envelope, not related to the decision, just a letter to an old friend. The air was cool, the wind light. She nodded to a neighbor passing in the opposite direction, their conversation no more than a polite greeting. Back home, she made herself a simple supper. She ate without hurry, the sound of the cutlery faint in the still kitchen. When the meal was done, she rinsed the plate and set it on the rack. Evening came early, as it often did in that season. She lit the lamp in the sitting room, its shade casting a warm circle of light across the table. The photograph on the mantel caught her eye again, the frame holding its position as if it, too, had decided long ago to remain where it was. She thought about the people in the picture, about the way life had moved them all into different places. Some choices had been made quickly, others, like hers now, had taken their time. Before bed, she took the notebook from the shelf once more and read the page she had written. No edits were needed. She closed it again, slid it back into place and turned out the lamp. The decision was not one she would speak aloud. It did not need to be. It was already part of the shape of things, settled into the quiet where it would stay until it was required. The letter was written on plain stationery, the kind she kept in the desk for small notes and thank yous. It was not long, 3 short paragraphs written in her careful, even script. She had started it weeks before, leaving it folded inside a book on the nightstand. Each time she passed the book, she would think of it, and sometimes in the evening she would open it and read the words again. It began without greeting. She had decided that the opening should be as direct as the rest, without the formality of dear, or to. The sentences were simple, each one set apart, with room between them. She did not explain everything, only what she felt needed to be said. The first paragraph held the heart of it, that she had noticed. Every silence. Every absence. Not in anger and not as a list of grievances but as a fact. She wrote that a person can feel the weight of being forgotten without shouting about it. That sometimes, it is the quiet that says the most. The second paragraph was smaller, just a few lines. She wrote about what she had chosen to do. She did not name names or describe exactly what she had changed, only that she had left something different than what might have been expected. She said it was not done to punish but to remind. The final paragraph was the shortest. It spoke of her hope that in time the message would be understood. That even if the understanding came late it might still matter. She ended with no signature, only a final line, "You will know why." She read it over 3 times before folding it neatly. The fold was sharp, the paper lying flat. She slid it into a plain envelope, unmarked, unsealed. It was to be placed with the other documents when the time came, to be read after everything else had been explained. The letter stayed on the nightstand for a while longer, resting between the pages of the book. It was not hidden, it simply waited. She sometimes thought about sealing it, but she liked the idea that someone would unfold it themselves, that their first sight of it would be the bare page with her writing already there. One evening, she moved it from the book to the desk drawer, placing it just above the envelope marked for the reading. The two rested together, the edges of their paper just touching. In the days that followed she did not think of it often. It had been written and that was enough. She had no urge to rewrite or add to it. The act of leaving it felt complete, like placing a stone in its final spot in a wall. It would not be seen now, but it would be part of the structure, holding its place until someone found it. When she closed the drawer, the sound was soft, almost absorbed by the quiet of the room. The letter was there, waiting. She would not open it again. The room was small, with pale walls and a single long table down the center. Outside, the street was bright with late morning light, but in here the blinds were half drawn, and the air felt still. A neat stack of papers sat at one end of the table, beside a glass of water. The lawyer stood behind the chair, waiting for everyone to settle. They came in slowly, removing coats, exchanging the brief greetings of people who see one another less often than they used to. Some looked at the floor, others at the table, a few at the photographs on the wall. She was not there, of course. That was the fact holding the room together, the reason for this gathering. But her presence was in the way people spoke more quietly, in the way they shifted in their chairs. When the lawyer began, his voice was even, steady, each word clear. He read through the formalities first, the legal phrases, the dates, the acknowledgments. Then he began to move through the list of items, each one named and assigned. Some were expected. Furniture to one person, the piano to another, the small collection of silver spoons to someone else. Heads nodded faintly. A few people glanced at each other when something familiar was mentioned. Then the unexpected began. The things they might have assumed would be theirs were instead given to others. Neighbors, an old friend from the church, a woman who had once worked at the post office. A photograph to one. A brooch to another. The scarf from the box on the wardrobe to someone they barely knew. The changes were not explained in the will itself, only stated plainly. Each item was moved deliberately, as if each belonged exactly where she had decided it should go. Near the end, the lawyer picked up a small unsealed envelope from the stack. He said only that it had been left to be read after the rest. He unfolded the paper inside, his eyes moving across the lines before he began. The words were short, clear. They spoke of being noticed and of noticing in return. They mentioned no names, no specific days, yet everyone at the table seemed to know what they referred to. There was no anger in the words, only a kind of plain truth, and a hope that it would be understood. When the lawyer finished, he set the letter down. No one spoke immediately. A chair shifted slightly. Someone coughed once, quietly. The meeting ended without ceremony. People gathered their coats, avoiding too much eye contact. Some took their papers and left quickly. Others lingered for a moment as if they might find more explanation in the room itself. Outside, the light was still bright, the street still the same. But for those carrying the knowledge of the morning, it felt different somehow, quieter, heavier. At home in her absence, the rooms would remain much as she had left them. The photograph would still be on the mantel. The box on the wardrobe's lower shelf. The bread tin in the kitchen with its lid closed. Her choices had been made quietly without warning, but they would stay in place now, fixed like stones set carefully into a path. Whether those who walked it noticed the shape she had laid out for them, that was something only time would tell.